From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Good morning, everybody. The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2017 to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN.
As the Nobel Committee makes their announcement today in Oslo, Norway, President Trump's expected to decertify the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal next week. We'll speak with the Asia-Pacific director of ICAN, that's the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, on winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And we'll go to Tehran and Washington to get the latest. Then, following the massacre in Las Vegas, when Stephen Paddock, the 64-year-old white man, killed 59 people, including himself, the National Rifle Association says it'll support regulation on the gun accessory known as bump stocks that enables semi-automatic rifles to shoot like automatic machine guns. Critics say it is not enough. We'll go to Las Vegas. Then, as FEMA removes data about Puerto Rico's lack of access to drinking water and electricity from its website, we go to the Puerto Rican island of Vieques to speak with residents of the area that the U.S. Navy used as a bombing range for decades, now a Superfund site.
We all know, we Viequenses, that in any place of our island we can find bombs, toxic waste from their practice, scrap metal, etc. Among other things they've not told us. Anything like that, which could have been around. Only God knows where they can be now.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This year's Nobel Peace Prize has just been announced.
Good morning, everybody. The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2017 to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, known as ICAN, is a coalition of non-governmental organizations in more than 100 countries. Launched in 2007, it helped organize a landmark victory this year, the world's first legally binding treaty banning nuclear weapons. The treaty was adopted by 122 UN member states in July, signed by 51 countries during the UN General Assembly in September. The treaty prohibits the development, testing, and possession of nuclear weapons, as well as using or threatening to use these weapons. It was adopted and signed by dozens of countries despite the fierce opposition of the United States and other nuclear-armed nations. This is the executive director of ICAN, Beatrice Finn.
We're working very hard on trying to make nuclear weapons illegal. They are not yet prohibited by a treaty, nuclear weapons. And I think that we're trying to change people's minds. People have been accepting nuclear weapons as legitimate tools for providing security for 70 years now. And we're trying to change the mindset, really, that it's not acceptable to threaten to level an entire city just to keep yourself secure.
That's ICAN's executive director, Beatrice Finn, speaking in Geneva, where the organization is based. The Nobel Peace Prize announcement comes as the Washington Post reports President Trump is expected to decertify the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal next week, saying the agreement is not in the United States' national interest. If this happens, Congress will decide whether or not to reinstate harsh economic sanctions against Iran. The move comes despite the fact the Trump administration begrudgingly certified Iran has complied with its obligations under the agreement earlier this year, as has the International Atomic Energy Agency. Defense Secretary James Mattis has also said he's in favor of sticking with the Iran nuclear deal. President Trump's potential sabotaging of the deal is only one of a growing number of nuclear threats under the Trump administration. Tensions have also risen sharply between the U.S. and North Korea over its nuclear program. Trump's repeatedly threatened to destroy all of North Korea, a nation of 25 million people. After Trump took office, the scientists behind the doomsday clock, which tracks the likelihood of nuclear war and other existential threats, moved the clock's minute hand 30 seconds closer to midnight. The clock is now the closest to midnight than at any time since 1953. We'll have more on the Iran nuclear deal, the Nobel Peace Prize, and the threats of nuclear war after headlines. Meanwhile, President Trump issued a cryptic threat Thursday night during a meeting with military leaders, saying this is the calm before the storm.
You guys know what this represents? Well, maybe just the calm before the storm.
What's the storm?
Could be the calm before the storm.
What storm is
We have the world's great military people in this room. I will tell you that. And we're going to have a great evening. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
What storm, Mr. President?
You'll find out.
What storm, Mr. President? A reporter asked. You'll find out, was President Trump's answer. This is the calm before the storm, he said. Trump's comments follow his recent admonishment of his military leaders during a cabinet meeting, telling them, quote, moving forward, I also expect you to provide me with a broad range of military options when needed at a much faster pace, unquote. In news on climate change, at least 22 people have been killed in Central America by the powerful tropical storm Nate. The storm has sparked widespread flooding across Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Honduras. It also shut down several offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. The storm is now barreling toward the U.S. Gulf Coast. In Puerto Rico, doctors say the island's health system remains severely damaged 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria, leaving more than 90% of the island without electricity and half of its residents without clean drinking water. That's at least according to statistics published by FEMA on Wednesday. But on Thursday, FEMA removed data about access to drinking water and electricity in Puerto Rico from its website. Also on Thursday, billionaire Elon Musk, owner of the electric car company Tesla, said he thinks his company could resolve Puerto Rico's energy problem through solar power. On Thursday, Puerto Rico's governor, Ricardo Rosselló, replied to Elon Musk on Twitter, writing, Elon Musk, let's talk. Do you want to show the world the power and scalability of your Tesla technologies? PR could be that flagship project, the governor tweeted. The Puerto Rico Electric Company is currently the largest publicly owned utility in the United States, and the electric power industry has long sought to privatize it. In a rare move, the National Rifle Association settled support regulation for gun accessories known as bump stocks, which allow semi-automatic rifles to act like machine guns, capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute. This comes following Sunday night's massacre in Las Vegas. Stephen Paddock, the 64-year-old white man, killed 59 people, including himself, and injured nearly 500 others. Authorities say Paddock had at least 12 bump stocks. The NRA, however, does not want the regulation to go through Congress, but instead wants it to be imposed by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Both Republican and Democratic lawmakers, however, are pushing for regulation on bump stocks. This is White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
We know that both members of both parties in multiple organizations are planning to take a look at bump stocks and related devices. We certainly welcome that, would like to be part of that conversation, and we would like to see a clear understanding of the facts.
But many say bump stocks regulation does not go far enough to prevent future mass shootings. For example, this potential regulation would not address how Stephen Paddock was able to stockpile dozens of firearms, including buying 33 weapons in the past year alone from Nevada, Utah, California, and Texas. USA Today is reporting President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his wife, Ivanka Trump, both advisors to President Trump, both of whom are senior White House advisors, rerouted their personal emails to computers run by the Trump Organization amidst investigations into their use of private email accounts for White House matters. The rerouting came after they received a letter from Maryland Congressman Elijah Cummings warning them not to delete emails emails sent over private accounts. They rerouted the emails through the Trump Organization, despite claiming that neither of them work for the organization any longer now that they hold official roles in the White House. Meanwhile, White House officials say they believe Chief of Staff John Kelly's personal cell phone has been compromised, perhaps since as early as last December. The White House's technical support staff reportedly discovered the potential hack after Kelly complained this past summer his phone hadn't been working properly for months. In more news from Washington, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigators met earlier this year with Christopher Steele, the former British intelligence agent who created an unsubstantiated dossier about Donald Trump during the 2016 campaign. The 35-page dossier alleged the Russian government had a slew of compromising information that it could use to blackmail President Trump. The meeting with Steele comes as part of Mueller's widening investigation into whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia to influence the 2016 election. A new bombshell report by the New York Times has revealed the powerful Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein has been the subject of sexual harassment and assault accusations for decades, and that he's paid off at least 8 women who confronted him about the alleged humiliating and degrading harassment. Among those who've accused him is award-winning actress Ashley Judd, who says when she arrived for a professional meeting with Harvey Weinstein, he showed up in a bathrobe and asked if he could massage her or whether she would watch him shower. Weinstein is one of the most powerful producers in Hollywood, co-founding Miramax Films and the Weinstein Company. One of his employees, Lauren O'Connor, wrote in an internal memo alleging a pattern of sexual harassment within Weinstein Company, quote, "There is a toxic environment for women at this company," unquote. Pennsylvania Republican Congressman Tim Murphy has resigned after revelations that the vehemently anti-abortion lawmaker had pressured a woman he was having an affair with to have an abortion. Forensic psychologist Shannon Edwards wrote to Murphy in January in the midst of a pregnancy scare, saying, quote, "You have zero issue posting your pro-life stance all over the place when you had no issue asking me to abort our unborn child just last week when we thought that was one of the options," unquote. According to text message records from Murphy's cell phone, he responded, "I get what you say about my March for Life messages. I've never written them. Staff does them. I read them and winced. I told staff, don't write any more. I will," unquote. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is slated to sharply limit contraceptive coverage under the Affordable Care Act, a move that could eliminate birth control coverage for hundreds of thousands of women. The administration's expected to announce the rule change today. A senior official within the Interior Department, Joel Clement, has resigned in protest of Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. Clement was an Interior Department scientist focusing on the dangers that climate change poses to Alaskan Native communities in the Arctic until he was reassigned from his position and instead tasked with collecting royalty checks from oil and gas companies. Dozens of other scientists inside the Interior Department have also been reassigned. After he resigned, Clement said, quote, "Secretary Zinke is really acting against all of the issues that are important to the health and safety of Americans and natural resources," unquote. To see an interview with him, go to DemocracyNow.org. In international news, in Pakistan, a suicide bombing at a Shiite mosque killed at least 20 people Thursday. The bombing was in a village in the southwest region of Baluchistan. 25 more people are wounded, some in critical condition. ISIS has claimed responsibility for the bombing. In Syria, the International Committee of the Red Cross is warning of a harrowing spike in violence in regions across Syria, including in Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, where the U.S.-led coalition is launching daily airstrikes against ISIS militants. The Red Cross says the fighting is the worst since the siege of East Aleppo in 2016. At least 10 hospitals have been damaged over the last 10 days. The Syrian and Russian governments are accused of killing dozens of civilians in airstrikes in recent days in Deir ez-Zor. This is Red Cross Regional Director for the Middle East, Robert Mardini.
enough precautions are not taken, because we bear witness to the suffering of people. We get testimonies from civilians fleeing Raqqa, fleeing Deir ez-Zor, who have heartbreaking stories to tell every day. It is hard to meet one single family who have fled recently Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor who did not have a family member killed on the way to safety, and this is of course unacceptable.
And California has adopted a so-called sanctuary state law aimed at limiting police statewide from cooperating with federal immigration agents and carrying out President Trump's mass deportations. The new sanctuary state law, signed Thursday, is the most expansive in the United States. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with news that the Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. The group, known as ICAN, is a coalition of non-governmental organizations in more than 100 companies. This is the chair in more than 100 countries. This is the chair of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, Berit Reiss-Andersen.
Good morning, everybody. The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2017 to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. The organization is receiving the award for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition on such weapons.
After the announcement at the news conference, reporters questioned the head of the Nobel Committee about the message the committee is trying to send with its award this year.
Yes. Has the risk that Iranian nuclear deal could unravel been a factor in your considerations? Thank you.
There has been an American diplomatic pressure on countries like Sweden to prevent them from signing the ICAN treatment. So is this prize, in a way, a kick in the leg, as one of your predecessors said, to the American president, Donald Trump?
The carefully monitored elimination of nuclear weapons by the 5 original states, would that help to prevent proliferation among states like North Korea?
Some of the reporters' questions at the news conference after the Nobel Committee announced that the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons had won this year's Nobel Peace Prize. ICAN was founded in 2007. It helped organize a landmark victory, the world's first legally binding treaty banning nuclear weapons. The treaty was adopted by 122 UN member states in July, signed by 51 countries during the UN General Assembly week in September. The treaty prohibits the development, testing, and possession of nuclear weapons, as well as using or threatening to use these weapons. It was adopted and signed by dozens of countries despite the fierce opposition of the United States and other nuclear-armed nations. This is the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Beatrice Finn, speaking in Geneva.
We're working very hard on trying to make nuclear weapons illegal. They are not yet prohibited by a treaty, nuclear weapons. And I think that we're trying to change people's minds. People have been accepting nuclear weapons as legitimate tools for providing security for 70 years now. And we're trying to change the mindset, really, that it's not acceptable to threaten to level an entire city just to keep yourself secure.
For more, we're joined by Democracy Now! Video stream from Melbourne, Australia, Tim Wright, Asia-Pacific Director of ICAN, the Nobel Prize-winning organization. First of all, Tim, congratulations.
Thanks very much, Amy. It's a huge honor.
How did you hear?
We received the news about 10 minutes before it was broadcast. There was a live stream on the Nobel Peace Prize website that we were following. We knew that we had been nominated, but we really didn't expect to receive it. So it came as a huge surprise, and we're really thrilled.
Well, we were all monitoring it here. New York time, it was 5 o'clock in the morning as the announcement was made. Talk about what ICANN does and what message you think the Nobel Committee is sending by awarding you the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, we were awarded the prize for our role in securing the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons adopted earlier this year. And there are many countries, of course, that don't support this treaty. And so I think that the prize will help us to put pressure on them to sign and ratify it. It's not just the nuclear-armed states, but also some of their allies that claim protection from US nuclear weapons, for example. We really need to bring them on board and join the 2/3 of the international community that support a nuclear weapon-free world and have voted in favour of this treaty.
Can you respond to some of the questions that were asked at the news conference after the Nobel Peace Prize was announced for the international campaign to abolish the nuclear weapons? You heard the issue of, well, the announcement that President Trump wants to decertify the nuclear deal, which will be made next week, apparently. And also the question of what kind of message is being sent to the countries that did not sign, including the United States, this treaty, this groundbreaking treaty.
Yeah, well, this award has been given at a time of great global tension. We've heard threats from President Trump that he'll totally destroy North Korea. The developments in North Korea are incredibly frightening, and the treaty that's been adopted offers an alternative pathway forward. In terms of the Iran deal, it makes no sense whatsoever that the United States would want to withdraw from that. This is a deal that is designed to stop another country from acquiring nuclear weapons. Why would President Trump be opposed to that deal? But the treaty that we've been involved in creating goes much further than just trying to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. It's about getting rid of the 15,000 nuclear weapons that already exist, and around 7,000 of those are in the US nuclear arsenal.
So can you talk about what happened at, in the signing of the treaty and then the ratifying of it? What exactly this does? And what does it mean that the United States and the other nuclear powers would not sign on?
Well, this is a treaty principally intended to stigmatise nuclear weapons and establish a pathway to their elimination. We never expected that the nuclear-armed nations would join the treaty at the outset, but they do have that option of joining at some point in the future. And the more countries that do get on board with this treaty, the more effective it will be in putting pressure on them to do the right thing and to join the international majority on this issue. It's simply unacceptable from our point of view to have weapons that are designed to kill civilians indiscriminately and on a massive scale. And there are prohibitions on chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines and cluster munitions. It's only logical that there's now a prohibition globally on nuclear weapons.
And in this time, when President Trump threatens to obliterate the entire nation of North Korea, 25 million people, what about the question the reporter asked? If nuclear countries signed on to this nuclear ban, would that give an incentive to countries like North Korea to disarm?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the spread of nuclear weapons has much to do with the failure of countries like the United States to honour their disarmament obligations. If they were serious about disarmament, if the original nuclear-armed nations were actually committed to that, then we wouldn't see other countries seeking to acquire nuclear weapons. So this new treaty establishes the same standard for all countries. It says that North Korea cannot have nuclear weapons, and the United States cannot have nuclear weapons because they're weapons with catastrophic consequences.
There was a very frightening moment for many when President Trump, standing with military officials yesterday, said this is the calm before the storm. And when pressed by reporters, what storm, he said, you'll see.
Yeah, it is really frightening, and it's easy to see how this situation could spiral out of control, and the consequences could be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people's lives lost as a result. So we need to take action now, and the most responsible thing for countries to do is to sign and ratify this treaty and to clearly display their opposition to these worst weapons of mass destruction.
I wanted to end by asking you, Tim Wright, about the role of survivors. The only 2 atomic weapons dropped in the world were on Japan in World War II, August 6th and 9th of 1945. Hibakusha, the survivors of that bomb, of those bombs, have spoken around the world. What kind of work has the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons done with them?
Well, we've worked very closely with survivors from those 2 cities, as well as survivors of nuclear testing around the world, whose testimonies to diplomats at the UN have been a really powerful motivating force. And when you hear what these people have gone through, to defend these weapons just becomes immoral, and they really helped us get this treaty over the line. And the treaty and the prize that we've now been awarded is really a tribute to the thousands of people around the world who have spoken out against nuclear weapons, who have protested at nuclear weapon facilities. And we need more of that. We need people to take their money out of banks that are investing in nuclear weapon companies. We need people to be putting pressure on their politicians. Every action that is taken will have a positive impact on making sure that this treaty fulfills its objectives.
I want to turn to Abaka Anjane Madison and end with her words. She's from the Marshall Islands, spoke on behalf of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons at the UN conference for the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons earlier this year.
For years, my home, the Marshall Islands, was used as testing ground for nuclear bombs, which contaminated our beautiful and pristine atolls for all time. Today, we carry in our bodies the legacy of these dreadful experiments. The cancer rate in the Marshall Islands is among the highest in the world. They treated us as guinea pigs. They told us it was for the good of mankind. The adoption of this landmark agreement today fills us with hope that the mistakes of the past will never repeat it.
Again, that was Abaka Anjane Madison from the Marshall Islands speaking on behalf of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, the organization, ICAN, that has just won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. It will actually be awarded in Oslo on International Human Rights Day, December 10th. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll talk about President Trump's reported decertifying the Iran nuclear deal, despite the fact that the Trump administration has certified that Iran has complied. Stay with us.
4 minutes left to go. Is this the end? Then message on your stereo. 4-minute warning. Everybody wants to know what should we do then. Increase your stories. A 4-minute warning. Sasha stands in his yellow cafe. Yes, the heart of the city is here, so he tells me. Sitting on his red leather sofa, he's rolling another Man, I'll see you when I see you. Holly is said to be the next big thing. In a high heel boots and a 2-inch earrings. Heart of glass, Blondie sings in her ear. You're a rock queen, honey, and we all hear you. Come on. 3 minutes left to go. Is this the end then? Message on your stereo. 4-minute warning. Everybody wants to know what should we do then. 3 short stories, a 4-minute warning.
4-minute warning by Mark Owen here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Amidst the news of the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, we turn to look at whether President Trump is trying to sabotage the Obama-brokered nuclear agreement with Iran and seek a war with Iran. According to the Washington Post, Trump's expected to announce next week the deal is not in the U.S. national interest and will move to decertify the deal. If this happens, Congress will decide whether or not to reinstate harsh economic sanctions against Iran, potentially tanking the landmark deal. The move comes despite the fact the Trump administration begrudgingly certified that Iran has complied with its obligations under the agreement earlier this year. Also, the International Atomic Energy Agency has said this, which closely monitors Iran's activities. Speaking to the UN General Assembly last month, President Trump slammed the Iran nuclear deal.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction. It is time for the regime to free all Americans and citizens of other nations that they have unjustly detained. And above all, Iran's government must stop supporting terrorists, begin serving its own people, and respect the sovereign rights of its neighbors.
Meanwhile, on Thursday night, Trump issued a cryptic threat during a meeting with military leaders, saying this is the calm before the storm.
You guys know what this represents? Well, maybe it's the calm before the storm.
What's the storm?
Could be the calm before the storm.
What storm, Mr.
We have the world's great military people in this room. I will tell you that. And we're going to have a great evening. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
What storm, Mr. President?
You'll find out.
You'll find out. That's what President Trump's answer was when reporters asked him about what he meant by his words, this is the calm before the storm. Trump's comments following his recent admonishment of his military leaders during a cabinet meeting, telling them, moving forward, I also expect you to provide me with a broad range of military options when needed at a much faster pace, unquote. If the Iran nuclear deal collapses, Iran can begin producing uranium and reprocessing plutonium immediately rather than waiting for 13 years as required under the agreement. Both Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Defense Secretary Mattis have urged Trump to uphold the agreement. This is Mattis speaking to senators just Tuesday.
If we can confirm that Iran is living by the agreement, if we can determine that this is in our best interest, then clearly we should stay with it. I believe at this point in time, absent indications to the contrary, it is something the president should consider staying with.
The New York Times reports the Trump administration plans to take a broader hardline stance toward Iran, including cracking down on the country's ballistic missile program and its alleged involvement in Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere in the Middle East. For more, we go to Tehran, Iran, where we're joined by Democracy Now! Video stream by Reza Saya, a freelance journalist who covered Iran for CNN International for over 7 years. After his coverage of the 2009 anti-government protests, Iranian authorities denied him permission to work there for 2 years. Saya later returned to Tehran to report on the ongoing nuclear talks, the 2013 presidential elections, the signing of the interim nuclear deal, and most recently, the 2017 Iranian presidential elections. Welcome to Democracy Now! Let's start off just by asking your response to this news that President Trump will decertify the Iran nuclear deal next week. How have people responded in Iran?
Amy, first off, let's pass along some new information. I just spoke an hour ago by phone to Bahram Hassani, the spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry. He's aware of the report by the Washington Post last night. He said he's going to reserve comment until the Trump administration makes an official announcement. As far as this news goes, I think a lot of people were curious what Mr. Trump was going to decide next week. I think a lot of people were eager to hear what he was going to decide. They weren't sure. Obviously, throughout his campaign for the presidency, he was speaking out against this deal, calling it the worst deal ever, an embarrassment. That kind of rhetoric continued through the early months of his presidency. After his meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, came out with statements suggesting that he was going to go after this deal. And indications are that the stage is set for Mr. Trump to make an effort to, at the very least, undermine, destabilize, and weaken this deal. What's striking is this, that the entire international community, all other members of the P5+1, all other world powers, the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, all of these governments, all of these states, all of these groups that are saying that this deal is working, that the deal is fulfilling its narrow objective of rolling back Iran's nuclear program. Essentially, it's two countries that are against this deal. The U.S., led by a Republican president, and the Israeli government, led by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And it looks like these two countries are going to go against international consensus and at the very least weaken this deal. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks.
And the news that Jim Mattis, who is the Secretary of Defense, said just Tuesday in testimony before Congress that he supports the deal. Of course, the U.S. has said that Iran has lived up to its part of the agreement.
Yeah, they have, and I think it's going to be important to see what happens in the coming weeks. There's a few things to remember. First off, the U.S. does not have unilateral authority to destroy this deal. This deal belongs to the UN Security Council, the international community. It's endorsed by the UN Security Council. And the certification process, whereby the U.S. president every 90 days has to certify this agreement to the U.S. Congress, is not part of this agreement. Iran views this as an internal matter with the U.S. So Iran may not see this as a violation, may not see decertification as a violation, and therefore may not take drastic measures to respond, which could include restarting their nuclear program. So I think in the coming days and weeks, the key is what the announcement is going to be. Is there a strategy behind it? And in the 60 days where Congress has to decide whether to reimpose unilateral nuclear-related sanctions, will they do that? Because if they do indeed do that, then it's very likely Iran will see this as a violation, and that could escalate things.
And finally, what would renewed sanctions mean against Iran for the people, for the economy?
I think it would mean a loss of the glimmer of hope that they had back in 2015 when this was signed. The moderacy or the liberals were very much hoping that this deal would lead to better relations with the West, with the international community, that would lead to a better economy. I think that hope will certainly erode. But in many ways, Iranians are used to this kind of treatment. In many ways, they haven't seen any tangible benefits from this deal because the economy hasn't improved. And if this indeed unfolds in a way where tensions escalate and the deal is undermined, I think they'll see this as more evidence that the intention of the U.S. government is to isolate, economically isolate, and politically isolate a country like Iran that doesn't serve the U.S. interest, that's not a client state like other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Israel to name two.
Reza Sayah, I want to thank you for being with us. Freelance journalist based in Tehran, Iran, speaking to us there. Covered Iran for CNN International for over 7 years. Was denied permission to work in Iran for 2 years. We're also joined in Washington, D.C. by Trita Parsi. Trita Parsi is the founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. Trita, you're author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Legacy of Diplomacy. What news do you have in Washington? It was the Washington Post that reports that Trump will decertify the landmark deal that is not just between the United States and Iran, but between a number of countries next week. And explain what that means, what role the president plays and what role Congress plays.
Thank you, Amy. This was not entirely unexpected. People knew that the Trump administration was looking for ways to get out of the deal, and much of the focus has been, would Congress reimpose sanctions once the president shifts this issue on to them? But I think a more important matter may actually be what Trump himself chooses to do outside of the nuclear deal once he has decertified. This little comment he gave about that this is the calm before the storm. The buzz here is that there's going to be a very significant ramping up and escalation in the region against Iran, potentially including shooting down Iranian airplanes, sinking Iranian ships in the Persian Gulf, targeting Iranian troops or Iranian allied troops in Iraq and in Syria. This has been the preference by some in Washington for quite some time, a belief that the United States for far too long had not been tough enough against the Iranians. This was also something that had been suggested by some in the Pentagon to the Obama administration. It was rejected, mainly because of the belief that this idea that you can have a small war with Iran is really not workable. How do you prevent a small war from becoming a really big war?
So what will happen in Congress? What is your sense, being right there, covering these issues extremely closely, what Congress will do, and the significance of President Trump pulling out of this landmark Iran deal, despite the fact that the Trump administration has certified that Iran has lived up to its side of the bargain? Him pulling out right after the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded to the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons.
Yeah, so before I go into Congress, let me just say one thing. If we take a step back, for the last 37 years, there's really only been one example in which the United States has been able to change in a significant way a core Iranian policy. And that has been through these nuclear negotiations. Everything else that has been tried, from sanctions to pressure to sabotage to threats of war, have failed. The only success we have is this nuclear deal. So if the Trump administration is concerned about Iranian policies in the region, then if it truly wishes to see a change there, there is a proven path that can lead to that, which is additional negotiations. For it to choose to walk out of this nuclear deal and then pursue a path that has a proven track record of failure, that can only really make sense if you want to see an escalation that could lead to war. If that is not your intent, it really is baffling as to why the president would be doing what he's doing right now. Now, when it comes to Congress, Congress is not eager to take on this issue. They already have too many issues on their plate, and they have not really managed to address any of them effectively. But also, it's easy for Congress to oppose this nuclear deal in 2015, particularly amongst the Republicans, when they kind of understood that their vote was inconsequential. At this point, they will own the disaster that will follow if they reimpose sanctions that violate the deal and causes the deal's collapse. And this is causing a lot of second thought in Congress right now. And the anger or frustration that exists that they feel that the president is pushing this issue onto them instead. Choosing not to do anything doesn't seem to be too likely either in Congress. So there's likely going to be some sort of a measure. And the measure then is going to be important to see, will it be a reimposition of the old sanctions, which would be a clear violation of the deal? Or are they going to try to find a third route that doesn't violate the deal explicitly so that they can say, well, we're not the ones responsible for collapsing this deal?
Trita Parsi, I want to thank you for being with us, President and founder of the National Iranian American Council, author of the book Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Legacy of Diplomacy. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Las Vegas. Stay with us. White Gloves by Krangbin here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. On Thursday, the National Rifle Association said it would support additional regulation on the gun accessory known as bump stocks. Investigators believe the device was used in Sunday night's mass shooting in Las Vegas, in which Stephen Paddock, the 64-year-old white man who killed 59 people, including himself, and injured at least 500 people. Authorities say Paddock bought at least 12 bump stocks, which allow semi-automatic rifles to act like machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute. The NRA's Wayne LaPierre and Chris Cox issued a joint statement Thursday, writing, quote, despite the fact the Obama administration approved the sale of bump fire stocks on at least 2 occasions, the National Rifle Association is calling on the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives to immediately review whether these devices comply with federal law. The NRA believes that devices designed to allow semi-automatic rifles to function like fully automatic rifles should be subject to additional regulations, they said. But many say the bump stocks regulation doesn't go near far enough to prevent future mass shootings. Legislators are now introducing a bill to deal with bump stocks, but many are saying that Congress must go far further. We go to Las Vegas, where we're joined by Annette Magnus Marquardt. She's executive director of the Nevada-based Battle-Born Progress. Annette, welcome to Democracy Now! I'm so sorry what has happened in Las Vegas, what has happened in your city. This mass killing, the single largest one by a lone gunman in U.S. history. Can you talk about what the NRA is doing? Rarely has it ever said it would do anything, but clearly the pressure is so enormous. They are saying, okay, let's deal with this one thing.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And it's been a terrible week in Las Vegas. And so, you know, I appreciate being on. We're happy to see that, you know, many of the legislators, including some of the ones here in Nevada, Congresswoman Dina Titus and various others, are supporting these regulations and moving forward with regulations to limit bump stocks, because that is part of the reason why this massacre occurred. However, we believe that this is going to then become an excuse for the NRA not to go further on this. At the end of the day, what we really need to do is real substantive gun violence prevention policy. And the bump stock issue is a very important part of that conversation, and we're very appreciative of that. However, we also know the NRA and we know their tactics. This is a political move on the part of the NRA to not have to go further for real gun violence prevention measures. And we know that they're going to use this now as an excuse to say, look, we gave you something, we're not totally against everything, and let's move forward with this so we don't have to take real action on gun violence. And so for me as an advocate, as somebody who's fighting for this every single day, you know, we want to see these bump stocks be taken out of commission. However, we also want to see real gun violence prevention legislation move forward, both at the state level and nationally.
You own a gun, Annette?
I do own a gun, yes.
So I wanted to ask you about, you know, bump stocks, whether or not it's regulated, and the NRA wants it to be done through the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, so it doesn't go to Congress and they're not voting on it. About what's happening in Nevada, I mean, it's not like he just used bump stocks. Stephen Paddock was able to stockpile dozens of firearms, something like 33 buying from 4 different states. Nevada passed legislation on background checks, but it's being held up by the state attorney general, Adam Laxalt.
That's exactly right. So I am a gun owner. We own a handgun. We don't own 33 weapons, unlike this terrorist did. And, you know, what we believe as gun owners, as responsible gun owners, is that there needs to be legislation in place to make it harder for people who shouldn't own weapons to own weapons. And so for me, question 1 is a great example of that. Our background check initiative, which passed, Nevada voters passed that in November of 2016. And Adam Laxalt, who's now running for governor, is one of the NRA's darlings, is refusing to implement that law, even though Nevada voters, the will of the people, put that forward and passed it. And so there's common sense solutions that we could be putting forward, both at, like I said, at the state level and at the national level, that would make a huge difference in our gun laws and make sure that people who should not own weapons do not own weapons. And again, as a responsible gun owner, it's my responsibility to go out there and say, We want these gun laws passed. We want better gun laws in this country because obviously something is wrong that we continue to have mass shooting after mass shooting over and over and over again, and now it's happened in my own backyard.
President Trump hasn't signed off on much major legislation, but one of his first moves to sign off on legislation that makes it easier for mentally disabled people to get weapons, more easy. And he continually talked about Paddock as a mentally defective man, a mentally demented man.
That's exactly right. You know, the Congress early this year, one of the first pieces of legislation.
Well, I think we lost Annette, but we will continue that discussion next week. Annette Magnus Marquardt, Executive Director of the Nevada-based Battleborn Progress, speaking to us from Las Vegas. As we end today's show, where we began the week in Puerto Rico, doctors say the island's health system remains crippled 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria hit the island, leaving more than 90% of Puerto Rico without electricity and half of its residents without drinking water. Well, that's at least according to statistics published by FEMA on Wednesday. But on Thursday, FEMA removed data from its website about access to drinking water and electricity in Puerto Rico. Well, Democracy Now's Juan Carlos Davila is on the ground in Puerto Rico. And this week, he managed to make it to the island of Vieques to speak with residents of the area that the U.S. Navy used as a bombing range for decades. Since the 40s, the Navy used nearly 3/4 of the island for bombing practice, war games, dumping old munitions, napalm. The bombing stopped after a campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience. Among those who got arrested was, the current Congressman, Luis Gutierrez. He got arrested twice in Vieques, protesting it being used as a bombing target. But the island now continues to suffer. The Navy says it'll take until 2025 to remove all the environmental damage left by more than 60 years of target practice. When Carlos filed this report from Vieques in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria.
Like most residents of Puerto Rico, the people of Vieques have been struggling with shortages of water, food, and medicine since Hurricane Maria made landfall. We visited the island on Wednesday without knowing what we can find. Telephones, cell phones, and internet service is not functioning in Vieques, and the only way in and out of the island is either by boat or plane. We began our visit by speaking to community leader Robert Rabin.
Vieques is a particular place with particular problems. The U.S. military presence on Vieques for over half a century put Vieques in a very vulnerable situation today, for instance. I mean, that problem of poverty, over 72% of Vieques community lives below the poverty line. And we, some studies indicate that the Navy presence here for over half a century meant the loss of over $100 million a year in possible income for Vieques if it had been able to develop a normal economy. And this is compared to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. The Navy owes the people of Vieques, the federal government owes the people of Vieques, a complete reconstruction of this community, not just because of Hurricane Maria, but, in light of this hurricane, in the aftermath of this hurricane, the federal government of the United States owes at least to Vieques to make sure every single family here is healthy, fine, has a good, solid house, and that there's economic development happening here on the island, without a doubt.
As we drove around Vieques, we witnessed dozens of houses completely destroyed. Unconfirmed estimates are that hundreds of houses are uninhabitable. During the afternoon, we went to the shelter Dale la Mano a Puerto Rico in the neighborhood of Las Marias, where some residents told their stories to us. This is Edwin Acosta.
Mi casa es de concreto, pero el techo.
I have a concrete house, but it had a wooden roof. Although it was secured, everything was gone.
Tenía buena seguridad, tú sabes, y cosas, pero todo se fue, perdimos todo.
We lost everything, furniture, everything that was inside the house. I was surprised. I thank God because these people welcomed us here, and they take good care of us.
Añoro estar en mi casa, de verdad.
But I miss being in my house, really.
Cualquier ayuda que me ayudaría.
Any help I can get to return to my house would be the most important thing right now.
Para mí en estos momentos.
Mi nombre es Heidi Juliet Torres Riveras.
My name is Heidi Juliet Torres Rivera. When the disaster arrived, I was surprised because I've never experienced anything like this. Many houses were lost. Many families right now have no home. My house doesn't have a roof at this moment. The beds are wet. Everything was lost. My sisters lost their houses. The families that lost everything, that don't have food and clothes, they lost everything, and it's very hard.
Another concern some Viequenses have after Hurricane Maria is how the contamination from the U.S. Navy might have spread, worsening the already severe health problems that the residents of the island face. Again, community leader Robert Rabin.
The hurricane moved in with a gigantic tidal wave sweeping directly over the bombing range. You know, many of us who are cancer patients, right, and I include myself, we're certainly concerned that this is going to bring more toxics into our immediate environment, and as well as creating serious danger for people who are in the water, particularly fishermen, other people who are in boats, or just people who go into the water.
Fishermen of Vieques said that Hurricane Maria caused an unprecedented rise in tides. Carlos Prieto Ventura went to look for his fishing boat inland, about a mile away from where it was originally anchored.
We took the boat to secure it at the bay. It is a very enclosed bay. This vessel had a 300-pound anchor with another anchor that was 30 feet long with a 2-inch thick rope. Nevertheless, it is here, almost a mile away from the place where it was anchored. It passed over mangroves 8 feet tall and arrived on firm land here, next to an area of thorn trees. It was dragged by what I understand was the hurricane tide and winds. And just as it was dragged, the storm could also have dragged any contaminant elements that our island could have. I think that the bombs, because of their aerodynamic form, are difficult to move, but without a doubt, the contamination from them, the material that was exposed at the moment of the hurricane tide, could have reached miles and miles away from where it was originally located. We all know, we Viequenses, that in any place of our island we can find bombs, toxic waste from their practice, scrap metal, etc. Among other things they've not told us. Anything like that, which could have been around. Only God knows where they can be now. That is, let's say, like a box of surprises. Now we really don't know where they could be.
Special thanks to Democracy Now!'s Juan Carlos Davila for that report from Vieques, Puerto Rico, with help from Edwin Velasquez. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez will be speaking tonight in Berkeley, California at 7:30 p.m. at Pegasus Books downtown. Next week, he'll be speaking at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. That's next Thursday. And on Friday night and Saturday, we'll both be speaking at the State University of New York in Albany. You can check our website for details. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Tarina Nadura, Amel Ahmed, and Nat Needham. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee are engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Gran, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars, Carl Marxer, and to our camera crew, John Randolph, Kieran Meadows, Anna Ozbek, Matt Ely, and Kaya Cirilla. To see all of our Puerto Rico coverage this week and last and the week before, go to DemocracyNow.org, as well as our coverage on issues related to gun control and on climate change, from Houston to Florida, the issue of climate change, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh as well. DemocracyNow.org is the website to go to, as well as Facebook and Instagram and beyond. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now! Thanks for joining us.